everyone, and welcome to episode 273 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If we thought hard, I'm pretty sure most of us could come up with a few names of the kings who ruled in England in the centuries before the Norman Conquest. But the queens? Maybe not. We know they existed, but it can be hard to figure out much else about them, or even whether later medieval notions of what queenship actually is even fit. Enter my next guest. This week, I spoke with Dr. Matthew Firth about early English queens. Matthew is Associate Lecturer in Medieval History at Flinders University and the author of many articles on Northern Europe in the early Middle Ages. He's also the assistant editor of the series East Central Europe 476 to 1795 and the reviews editor for the Journal of the Australian Early Medieval Association. His new book is Early English Queens, 850 to 1000, Potestas Reginae. Our conversation on what queenship looked like at this point in English history, the role queens played in legitimizing a king's right to rule, and how 3 incredible women shaped English royal history is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Matthew, for coming on to talk to us about early English queens. It is a pleasure to meet you. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
And I just want to say congratulations to you and us for making this work, because we are on opposite sides of the globe and we have made this work, and we need to celebrate this.
Yep, it's excellent. It's a lovely morning here in Adelaide. I'm nice and fresh for doing something like this today.
Yes, and we are already in winter darkness here in Canada, so total opposites. Okay, but we're going to travel over to England now. When we're talking about early England, what period are we talking about?
So I'm sort of late early England, shall we say. I'm the years 850 to 1000. So the book covers a period where we're starting to see the foundations of what could be called a single kingdom of England. So where I start out at 850 in the book, we still have multiple English kingdoms. Mainly Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. The smaller kingdoms have fallen away a little bit. And then we have, in the late 9th century, the arrival of the Viking armies, what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the heathen army. And these smaller kingdoms, again, start to fall until we get that famous moment where Wessex stands alone. Alfred the Great rides out of the Somerset levels. He takes the battle to the Vikings, and we have the formation of the Danelaw in the north and the east. And then, under English rule, Mercia and Wessex down south. Most of the book covers the 10th century. I start at 850 for various reasons. I think we need to see the foundations of English queenship in the late 9th century. But once we get to the 10th century, we're really dealing with this sort of coalescing of power around the West Saxon dynasty. So Alfred's children and their children. By the time we get to the late 10th century, we really do have what would be called a Kingdom of England under a king named Edgar the Peaceful. It's a fascinating period of time. I think there's lots of political intrigue in here, lots of quite famous stories as far as early English history goes. But the story of what's happening in relation to queenship is a little less told during this period. So that's what I really wanted to do in the book, is pull out how the idea of the consort sort of goes from a bed companion in the mid-9th century through to a crowned queen by the time we get to the late 10th century.
Yes. So when we're talking about queens at this time, one of the things that you lay out right at the beginning is that it is harder to spot them than we might actually imagine, because it's not black and white. You are not a queen and then you are a queen. So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the bedrooms of kings here that makes it so difficult?
Look, we're in a period before the Gregorian reforms, which happens, 11th, 12th century, to really formalize the idea of marriage, particularly around royalty. It sort of lays out the lines of inheritance, etc., makes succession a lot smoother. Where before that, we've got this idea of companionship as opposed to marriage going through our English kings at this time. We have a series of people that we like to call serial monogamists. So, we're not talking polygamy or polygyny. What we are dealing with is kings who have one consort at a time, but if he sees a better match, he might repudiate that consort, send her off to an abbey or something, and then take another consort. Sometimes we're not clear what has happened to these women. I say multiple times in the book, she may have been repudiated, or she may just have died. It's not of interest to our chroniclers what has happened to that queen or consort. What's interesting is the next one that comes along. And very often what we find is our most powerful queens are the person who is consort at the time that the king dies, because there's no longer a chance to repudiate her. She has still got that residual power from having been his consort. And then that, of course, enables her, if she's had a son, to sort of gain power from him as well. It's very easy to repudiate a consort during this period. It's much harder to repudiate your mother.
That's true. I mean, that should be on a t-shirt. It is so true. So what happens to these women who are repudiated? For example, where do they go? Are they just like, I was going to say thrown off a cliff? Because when we think about getting rid of a spouse that you don't want, sometimes there are violent means to do that, but that is not necessarily what's happening to these women. So what is happening to these women?
Look, it's often quite hard to trace. The nearest one that we have is Edgar the Peaceful's second consort, Wulfthryth. So this is in the mid-10th century, 950s-ish. There's a whole sort of salacious story that goes along with her. She's apparently in an abbey already, probably under lay-vow. She's probably not actually a nun, but we know that that her family is from nobility. Edgar sees her as a particularly good match, and he goes and he grabs her from the nunnery. He marries her, they have a child, or well, we think he marries her, they have a child, but it's a daughter. Whether that's the reason or whether his next consort just appears a better political match, he repudiates Wulfthryth and he sends her and her daughter off to a nunnery. Now, he is very kind to her in some ways. I suppose it needs to be political consideration that you don't want this consort and particularly this child to become loci for alternative political factions. So he installs her as abbess there. So she has some independent power. And we have two instances of land grants going to her. So she's looked after, but she's sort of taken off the market, I suppose, is a way of looking at it. There's no other sort of scion of the West Saxon house, a different branch of the royal family that can come along and marry her and take that child and raise them as an alternative to the throne. Most of the other women we can trace tend to be those that are widows. When a new heir comes in, we often have horizontal succession during this period. So instead of going from father to son, it goes from brother to brother. So when we have a widow in those circumstances, the new incoming brother seems to push the consort aside, but again, they can be well looked after. So the consort of King Eadgifu, who was also in the mid-10th century, her name is Eadgifu, and she appears to have been looked after by Edgar. We get a couple of examples of land grants there, and we seem to have a will from her as well, where she probably died quite wealthy. So they are looked after. They're not, just thrown off a cliff. But for the same token, a lot of them just disappear from the historical record because they cease to be of interest to our chroniclers who are really focused on royal history.
Yes, and a lot of the sources, as we should mention, a lot of the sources for the book are not just the chronicle sources, but sources in which these women might be attaching their name to a document, a charter. And of course, if you don't have any more power, you're not going to show up on those charters either.
No, that's right. So charter witness lists are very exciting. I'm sure everyone who reads the book loves all of the tables that lay out all of the witness lists. But look, they're really an important way of tracing what these women are doing, how prominent they are at court. So for those who don't know the way that a charter witness list looks, you have the king at the start, because he's the most important person. He's giving the land or the rights or what have you. You often have the Archbishop of Canterbury second, and then sort of in descending order of importance, you get bishops, abbots, lords, and dukes, etc. We get the queens showing up in this, and sometimes they're really prominent. Some queens are listed before the Archbishop of Canterbury even, which makes it then appear that king and queen are giving something in tandem. But then you also have them appearing really low in witness lists, and sometimes you can sort of watch them drift down over time as the sort of centrifugal forces of the court push them to the periphery. But then you also, as in the examples of those two repudiated women we were just talking about, we find them sort of being gifted things later on. So as opposed to being in the witness list, they're the actual recipients. But one of the things we need to remember with charters as well is that even though got thousands of them. I think we've got about 1,800 of them listed. This is still a fragmentary historical record. Not every charter from this period has survived. So we're piecing together what we can from the little bits of evidence that we have.
Yes, but as far as evidence goes, these are great little nuggets of evidence. And if ever somebody is going to be excited about these charter witness lists, it's going to be the people listening to the Medieval podcast. So these are your
Excellent.
people. So you have chosen to focus mostly, we have a couple of peripheral figures in your book, but you've chosen mostly to focus on three women. Why did you choose these particular three?
Well, look, the lazy answer is that there's the most evidence for them. But for the same token, they offer some excellent stories. Aethelflaed, who is probably the most famous pre-conquest Anglo-Saxon queen. I say queen, I make the argument in there that certainly from outside of Mercia, where she is ruling, she is seen as a queen. But she is also one of the very few people from women from this period that we see ruling in their own rights. So she's the daughter of Alfred the Great. Sometime during Alfred's lifetime, the late 9th century, she's married to the Duke of Mercia, Aethelred. We're not exactly sure when that happens because a lot of these women sort of appear in the historical record almost wholly formed because our chroniclers don't know they're going to be important until they are. But Alfred dies in 899, and then Ethelred and Aethelflaed seem to rule Mercia more or less in their own right until 911, when Ethelred dies. And then for the next 7 years, Aethelflaed rules in her own right. She wields something that very much looks like regnal power. There are some arguments that it's her brother, Edgar the Elder, ruling Wessex, who is sort of giving her that power. But I don't think it's that clear cut. I actually think that she and Mercia are relatively independent during the period that she rules. She really takes the battle to the Scandinavians who are inhabiting sort of ex-Mercian towns like Tamworth, like Derby, and we don't necessarily see her on the ground with her troops, but we certainly see her directing these incursions against people who could, I suppose, still be called invaders at this point. We're really not that far after the arrival of the heathen army. So she's fascinating. I couldn't sort of leave her behind. The big sort of question is whether or not she should be in a book about queenships because she's not exactly a queen. And I don't think she influences the trajectory of queenship that much. But nonetheless, she's an interesting case study. The second woman is Eadgifu, and she is the one that I'm really trying to rehabilitate because I think that she is absolutely pivotal to the development of queenship in late Anglo-Saxon England. And the reason being is that she is there for so long. She marries Edward the Elder in probably around 920. She doesn't witness any charters during his reign. So we're still in that old paradigm of queens not being, or consorts not being particularly important. But she is in place when he dies. Now, one of her stepsons, Athelstan, takes the throne. He's actually older than she is. But she has lots of familial landholdings in Kent. So she probably retreats to Kent with these two young sons she's had with Edward. And they are the heirs for the throne. So when she comes back with these 20-year-old kids after Athelstan's death, she is suddenly this very powerful woman. She witnesses over 52 charters. It's completely unprecedented, but interestingly not as queen, as Mater Regis, mother of the king. So it's the motherhood that really gives her power. But all in all, she's at the peak of political power for about 40 years. And during the reigns of those two sons, she is solidly there for 16 years. And I think by the time we get to the reign of her grandsons, they can't conceptualize an idea that there's a court without some powerful woman there. So Eadmi actually doesn't like his grandmother very much. He repudiates Eadgifu. He sends her into exile down in Kent again. But his first move is to find some other powerful woman, someone from a different branch of the West Saxon royal family, and bring her into court. And we find her in witness lists as well. So I think Eadgifu really shifts the idea of what queenship is. And then I finish with Aelfthryth because you have to, because she is our first known crowned queen consort of England. She is crowned in 973, despite the fact that she has been queen for a fair bit longer than that. We think she was probably crowned twice. But this is part of all of these church reforms that are going on in the 10th century in England as well. This idea of sacral kingship enters the political zeitgeist. And alongside it, we get this idea of sacral queenship as well. So Aelfthryth is explicitly given charge of the kingdom's nunneries. So she's supposed to protect them, and she demonstrates that she can also have a little bit of control over them as well. But what this does is it starts to entrench some sort of responsibility. Do you really have an office of queen if there's no responsibilities that go along with it? And in Aelfthryth, we start to see that the office of queen has distinct roles, distinct spheres of responsibility.
I mean, that's a great answer.
Thank
This
you.
is why we have it. It was why we have all of these women in here. And they are very different. And it's interesting in the ways that this plays out, especially the way you're able to put this together with such, I was going to say sketchy sources, not meaning that they are not reliable, but there aren't very many sources for you to pull from, especially for these women's lives. And it should be mentioned that when we look back at these women sort of in later medieval writings, they are all sort of cartoonized, which is something we can maybe talk about in a minute. So let's kind of go back to the beginning here with Aethelflaed. So she is really well known. She's made to be a hero in her moment and later on. And still, I think she still has this sort of luster to her being. How do you feel people are reacting to her at this time? Because she is sort of leading, as you say, these campaigns to rebuild places that had been strong before that need to be strong again, and to actually retake some territory. So how do you feel people around her are seeing her, especially because she does not have a crown in the way that later figures will?
I think Mercia in general has been very practical at this point in time. I think they realize the power of Wessex. Our Mercian sources call her the Lady of the Mercians. They don't call her queen. Now, Welsh sources are calling her queen. Irish sources are calling her queen. But the Mercians themselves are treading very carefully around the terminology. But she issues a couple of charters herself. We clearly see a sort of independent Mercian court going on. And we have one entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle where some of her thanes die outside the walls of Derby. And it's sort of one of the few instances that we might get a glimpse of her emotions. And what it appears to me is that she and Ethelred were working very explicitly to set her up to take the throne after Ethelred died. And we have some hints that Ethelred knew that he was sick from at least around 902. So he's sort of there, but not necessarily completely politically active for about a decade until Aethelflaed takes over in 911. But I think that they have done enough work to really entrench her as the power in Mercia. So I think she is really being seen quite positively within her own kingdom at this particular point in time. Now, our only sources are either Mercian or West Saxon, and the West Saxon sources do tend to ignore her altogether. So we're trying to balance these two viewpoints, but that's where those external sources that see her as a queen really come in quite handy. Whatever she is doing in Mercia, all of these activities on the peripheries, on its borderlands, are clearly leaving enough of an impact that people outside of Mercia, except for Wessex, which has a political reason to sort of push her to the side, sees a very, very powerful woman and a legitimate leader. And we do have one instance where we sort of see her taking her own punitive action, where one of her bishops is killed by the Welsh, and she sort of sets up a flash campaign, shall we say, into Wales as a retributive action. So we see her really reacting to current political circumstances. And right at the end of her life, we also find, or we're told that York, the Scandinavian city of York, is ready to capitulate to her rule. So again, we're sort of seeing some indicators that within Northern England, she is seen as a very powerful, influential, and successful figure. She almost dies when things are really getting interesting, because had York come unto mercy and rule, it'd be, one of those what ifs. How would the English kingdom have formed after that? I really think Mercia might have been more powerful than Wessex at that particular point in time. But
Yes.
unfortunately, she dies at the wrong moment.
Well, it's an interesting question because I think one of the things that you pulled out really well in the book is that she might be working with her brother Edward and the Kingdom of Wessex to maybe bring these kingdoms together later. But if she's in charge of York, maybe she doesn't have the impetus to do that. Maybe she doesn't want to bring these together at that
No,
point.
that's right. And look, one of the really interesting things she does is she tries to pass power to her daughter as well. Now, I play a little bit devil's advocate in the book. I wonder that this might have been a placeholder moment, that she had this set up with Edward, that Edward had to come up and take control of Mercia, but we can't have a power vacuum. So the daughter then steps in. But then if we take it at face value that she really was trying to pass power to her daughter, then Aethelflaed clearly perceived herself to be in quite a powerful independent position in her own right.
Yes. And one of the things I think is so interesting about her power is that often there is an argument that women shouldn't take power because they might die in childbirth. And she has had one child she doesn't have anymore. And her own daughter, I think, from what you mentioned in the book, is not married either. So she has got herself sort of in an Elizabeth I sort of position where she's not in danger of dying in childbirth. She could take that power herself, but it doesn't turn out that way.
Doesn't work out. Edward pops up and he does the old send the rival for the throne to the nunnery thing. So yeah, unfortunately, Aethelflaed's daughter winds up in a nunnery as well.
It's too bad because you can imagine having a mother like that. She might have had quite a long way to go if she hadn't been sent off to a nunnery.
Yep, another one of those wonderful what ifs.
I mean, the Middle Ages is full of them. But I think it's so interesting when we're looking at all of the transfers of power throughout your book. It's not like Game of Thrones. You might be having a sister and a brother working together, and you might have well, most of these transfers of power are happening peacefully. And that is something that maybe is unexpected when people are looking at this particular point in time.
Yeah, look, we've got a few rivalries going on. Eadwy and Edgar, we seem to have different factions lining up between them, but when Eadwy dies, everybody just comes back together without a problem. There aren't sort of those residual things going on. Aelfthryth, I mean, it's one of the wonderful stories that goes along with her. Perhaps she murdered her stepson. But again, the kingdom still really holds together through this period of political intrigue and, power passes between brothers without too much retribution seeming to go on. Going back to those charter witness lists, we see that the makeup of the court seem to remain the same most of the time. We don't often get earls or thanes who are sent away from the country or no longer brought up to court or anything like that.
Well, speaking of bringing people up at court or away from court, this is where I was going to go next with this. Is that after Edward dies, Athelstan comes to power. I have that right, right?
Yep, yes,
Yes.
that's right.
Excellent. Excellent. And then his stepmother is pushed to the side, but she's not murdered. She's not thrown in a nunnery. She's given the ability and the right to raise her sons as possible heirs to the throne in case Athelstan doesn't have any heirs to the throne. And this is actually a very powerful position to be in. If you don't have a consort that is raising your own heirs, having your heirs raised by your stepmother is actually quite a big thing.
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. His stepmother, Eadgifu, was actually younger than Athelstan, so Edward the Elder's third consort. And when Edward dies, the two children are infants. They're very young. There is some suggestion, some big name queenship scholars, Pauline Stafford, Barbara York, have suggested that there may be an agreement between Athelstan and Eadgifu at this period in time. So if he doesn't marry, he doesn't have any children, and she just takes these potential rivals for the throne down to her familial landholdings in Kent, keeps Sturm and raises them over there without getting involved in politics, then he will hand the throne to them in due course. Now, I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced of that because Athelstan is on the throne for 15 years. It's quite a long time to not have any children. He doesn't appear to have any consorts, but then they don't normally appear in the historical record if they don't have children anyway, because until they have children, they're rather unimportant.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that, from the perspective of the chroniclers, not my perspective, obviously.
Yes.
But yes, so you could look for more basic biological reasons. Maybe he can't have children. The fact that he brings his half-brother Edmund up to court when he's 14, when he's quite young, says to me that he's sort of recognized that things are getting urgent. He's not going to have any children. He needs to start doing some succession planning. So look, you could go either way on that. I struggle a little bit to see that this deal could really hold for that long. But look, yes, Eadgifu seems to do a wonderful job of raising these two children, and certainly when Athelstan dies, she is very much positioned personally to leverage the power that comes with being the mother of the king. And she comes back with the second son as well. So it's Edmund and Eadred. So she comes back with Edmund, who is the one that takes the throne, but she brings Eadred too. And in the Child of Witness list, they're almost working as a triumvirate. So we have this mother sort of guiding her sons, but we're already succession planning for when Edmund dies. We've got Eadred ready to go, which tells you something about mortality at the time. The West Saxon dynasty don't live to old age. These guys almost all die quite young.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and so that is what makes me also question that argument that people have made that Athelstan didn't bother to take care of his lineage because, well, first of all, it's his responsibility. Secondly, the chroniclers would tell you if he was celibate because they really celebrate that stuff. But
Yes, this is true. You know, when you get to Edward the Confessor, who's right at the tail end of this period, of course, one of the big stories that grows around him is that he and Emma had this chaste marriage, this very pious marriage.
yeah, it's a story that people like to tell. So the idea, I mean, having a reign that lasts 15 years is actually quite unusual. And
It's
so,
quite the feat for this period.
right. And I do think it's very interesting that you have a mother, a stepmother, who is raising the heirs to the throne away from the court, because I think the implication is before Edmund shows up at court, I think that the understanding is that his mother is going to teach him about politics, right? Not just like
Mhm.
crochet or anything like that, but how the entire kingdom works. So, understanding at this point, before we have the role of queenship that we understand now, to understand that this woman has the power to teach politics at home, I think is a big deal.
Yep. Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that. And, you know, she is at the peak of power for quite a long time. She does really have a great deal of political awareness. But for the same token, Edmund is brought to court by Athelstan during his own reign. So clearly, Athelstan thinks that there needs to be some practical political experience that goes along with this. It's not enough just to be sitting down there with Eadgifu and her immediate family.
Yes. Well, what's interesting about Eadgifu and her immediate family, what we're talking about, is that it goes so well, from one king to the next king to the next king. And then her first grandson comes to power, and then things don't go so well. Like, what has he got against grandma here?
Yeah. Look, it's a bit hard to know what Yardley has against everybody. I suspect that he probably saw an opportunity to sort of entrench his own lineage. So we have to step right back in the historical timeline to Alfred the Great's brother. But he has a couple of sons. Now, what happens is we're in the middle of these Viking wars. Alfred's brother dies. Who do you want on the throne? His adult brother or his infant children? So the Witan elects Alfred to be king. But now you have a separate branch of the West Saxon royal family. After Alfred's lifetime, they try to make a play for the throne. It never quite happens. But by the mid 10th century, when Eardwy comes to the throne, we've still got these scions out there. And Eardwy chooses one of them as his consort. And at the same time, he promotes the family that's around her to various earldoms, gives a lot of land grants. The traditional way until the last 20 years of looking at this was that he was quite an irresponsible youth, that he came to the throne young, he's just handing out lands to mates. What he actually appears to be doing, the idea that's consolidated in the last 20 years, is he's building his own power base, not out of other young men, but out of another legitimate branch of the West Saxon royal family. And he's trying to sideline all of the advisors from his uncle and his father's reign. So that includes very big names like St. Dunstan, who becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury. But one of their key allies is Eadgifu. So he has to push her out of there if he wants to entrench his own power base. Now, I am very dubious about the story that often goes along with this, that he took all of her lands away. Eadred, her second son, had left her most of the dynastic land holdings. Eadwy really can't allow that to fall into his grandmother's hands. He's alienating a huge source of wealth. So I think that's probably what's taken away from her. That will is never enacted. But she has to go somewhere. She probably just goes back to Kent. She has these big familial landholdings. She has family down there. That's probably where she winds up. The problem is that Eadwi's story is then told through the rhetoric of St. Dunstan's hagiographers later. And so Eadwi is very much demonized. He's during his coronation feast, he's off having threesomes, and his mother-in-law tries to murder St. Dunstan before he leaves English shores, or all of this sort of nonsense. But, it just seems to be that he's trying to establish an alternative power base. And this is where different factions do align behind different brothers, because the other grandson is Edgar the Peaceful. When he comes back to court, Dunstan comes with him. Grandma starts appearing in charters again. So, again, another what if. Who knows what would have happened if Eadwi had reigned for longer? But Eadwi dies when he's about 24, and it's another young death in this dynasty.
Yes, it really could have gone a completely different way, like a completely different
Yes.
dynasty.
And the longevity of some of these women is what makes queenship sort of grow into this powerful role, because you have these kings dying off on regular intervals, but these women are just there for the whole time. It's also part of what makes someone like St. Dunstan so powerful, because he comes up in Athelstan's reign and he survives into Aethelred the Unready's reign. He's there for almost the entire century. That continuity really helps to stabilize the politics more so than the kings do.
Yeah, so it's making me think of Survivor, where you just have to outlast, just to
Yep.
outlast
Yeah.
everybody.
And look, all of the most powerful kings we have in this period, or let's say in the 10th century, I'd say Athelstan and Edgar the Peaceful, they just managed to last for, over a decade. And that's how they become powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And once women get out of childbearing years, there is no stopping us. We can last a very long time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Eadgifu is showing up in one of Edgar's charters in 966 and trotted out as the grandmother of the queen as part of this witness list that clearly promotes the succession of the West Saxon dynasty. But it's also pointing to these links. It's like, here's Eadgifu. She has been around as long as the political community of this realm remembers. She married Edward the Elder 60 years ago, and here she is still.
Yes, and very powerful. So, how much do you think her example had to do with the queenship of the next person, the next figure who shows up in your book, who is a third wife of Edgar, who is Aelfthryth? How much do you think that the example of Eadgifu has on Aelfthryth?
Look, I think she's pivotal to the way that Aelfthryth approaches power. What Eadgifu does is she shows that allying yourself with important churchmen, becoming an interface between the court and the church, is a really useful space, a really powerful space that a queen could fill. And this is what lies behind Aelfthryth's power. Her main ally is St. Aethelwald, who is the Bishop of Winchester. He's another one of the reforming bishops. He and Dunstan sort of work together through a lot of the 10th century to get the church reforms thereafter. And part of this is this idea of sacral kingship and sacral queenship. So Aelfthryth sees pretty early on that this is a smart way to go. And interestingly, she is Edgar's third consort. So Edgar hasn't gone on this program of sort of formalizing his relationship with his first two consorts. So clearly something has shifted here. And I think a lot of that is around the political discourse that goes along with marriage and what queenship means that comes out of these church reforms. So what happens is in around 970, we have the Regularis Concordia issued. Now, this is St. Ethelwald's attempt to sort of regulate monastic practice in the realm, which sounds like a place you're not really going to find queens, but in the preface it says that the queen has control over the realm's female religious houses. And a lot of these female religious houses are royal foundations in the first place. Some of them are even set up to give a royal daughter something to do. That's the case with Shaftesbury Abbey. The story is that Alfred the Great sort of established that in order to put his daughter in there as its abbess. So we have all of these royal connections here anyway, and then the Queen is explicitly put in charge. And then we also have this New Minster Refoundation Charter, which is the one in which Eadgifu appears. And we have the very interesting phrase there where Aelfthryth is called legitima conjuncts regis, so the legitimate wife of the queen. So we're starting to get this real acknowledgement of marriage, not just of queenship. And once you've sort of publicly acknowledged your marriage, all of a sudden repudiation is a lot harder. The church has clear ideas on marriage even before the Gregorian reforms. If you're not announcing that you're married to this woman, if she's just your bed companion or what have you, it's quite easy to set her aside. Now we've formalized this. So number one, she's my wife. Number two, she's now given control of the female monastic houses. And then number three, in 973, she's crowned, and we have the coronation order for her. So she pushes where queenship is a long way. Not necessarily entirely through her own volition. We do have these political players like Dunstan and Aethelflaed sort of playing politics through her, establishing these ideas behind sacral kingship, sacral queenship, even almost some imperial overtones to all of this. But for the same token, she makes really intelligent decisions about who she is going to ally with. And the example for that is Eadgifu. She is definitely working from this basis that Eadgifu set her.
I asked the question because this is the woman, Aelfthryth, who is accused of murdering the king, Edward the Martyr. I mean, it's right in the name, in case people are trying to play along at home. So I'm wondering about how much this has to do with security. So we're talking about repudiating consorts and stuff like that. And I think it's pretty hard to say when the church rules are coming up and the church is becoming more powerful and enforcing the rules a little bit more, or pressuring people to follow rules like this is how you get married, this is how you stay married. But I was just sort of musing on whether this coronation, this idea of marriage, is to do with making sure that she is secure before Edgar dies. And then, of course, this is something that she becomes less secure, perhaps, when a son that's not her own comes to the throne. And of course, cartoonizing her from later on, people will say, she's the evil stepmother. It must have been her that killed him. So yeah, just looking at queenship coronation, to me, I was just wondering if you think this has to do with establishing security for a woman who is at the top, and maybe it's still a precarious position.
I think early on, she probably marries Edgar around 962, I think. And we see her modes of address change in the charter witness lists as she has children. So there is some idea of security there. And, for all queens in this period, and really up into the modern day, having a son is really important for your own security. And she has that first son who doesn't survive, actually, but he appears in the charter witness list in that Newminster Refoundation Charter as the legitimate heir of the king. Now, his brother, who is Edward the Martyr, only appears as heir of the king, not legitimate heir. So already, even though Edward is older, his infant brother's being promoted above him. So we're getting this idea of legitimacy. We seem to have clear indicators that Aelfthryth was a wife, was married to the king. She comes from a very powerful family, so perhaps this is just part of the negotiations for her becoming the consort, this idea of some sort of formalization of the relationship. Undoubtedly, she did have concerns for this herself. The question is how much power she had to sort of enact any of these policies. I think really what we're seeing is a succession policy driven by Edward's desire to start moving towards something that looks like primogeniture. So from father to son, get rid of all of this brother nonsense that's been going on. He wants to stand at the head of a continental style dynasty. He's conscious of the changes that are happening in kingship on the continent as well. He's been observing the Carolingians, the 973 coronation. He is rowed up the River Dee by all of these Welsh kings. There is, again, these real imperial overtones. So he knows what he's doing. And part of what's happening on the continent is that these Carolingian kings are starting to formalize queenship as well. So I think a lot of it's in imitation of that. Aelfthryth is absolutely in the right place at the right time, and she is certainly a savvy political player, and she gets security out of it. But as you said, when Edgar dies in 975, we see that this is no less precarious than queens who have gone before her in less formal relationships, because she does disappear from court for 3 years. because she's not part of the winning faction. Her half-son, Edward, takes the throne. And as far as the murder goes, cui bono, she does benefit more than anybody else out of it. I will absolutely say there is no contemporary evidence that she did it, but as I always say to my students, if she was male, you would just look at this as a practical exercise of politics. Murder the rival for the throne and take the throne. We would not be gasping in horror, and certainly medieval commentators wouldn't have been gasping in horror if it was one king getting another king out of the way. So she's not necessarily behind it, but she certainly had a lot to benefit out of it. She comes to court with a 10-year-old son, Aethelred the Unready, and she exercises regency powers through his minority. She is the most powerful woman we see throughout the entire 10th century in that moment as Queen Mother. And she does witness Potestas Reginae. She does appear as queen.
Yes, well, I mean, this is the case that people will make for Richard III as well, right? If he didn't do it, there are many people who would have thought it was to his benefit if they did it. So,
Yep.
It is to her benefit that Edward just disappears.
It is, absolutely. And the earliest documents we have this are written during her lifetime, and they sort of say a conspiracy of magnates arranged for Edward's death. But politically, are you going to write as a chronicler that the Queen killed him while the Queen's still alive? I mean, that doesn't seem to be something you do for your good health, does it?
It's not something that I would want to do. No.
No. But look, once her son Aethelred dies, the accusations start to come really quite quickly. And we do have marginal annotation in Anne of Bremen quite early on that she and Aethelred were behind the murder. Obviously, 10-year-old Aethelred, I mean, I have a 10-year-old, perhaps he was behind the murder. No, 10-year-olds don't normally think in that way. So if anyone who is coming to power is behind it, then we do need to look at the very least at Aelfthryth's allies.
Right. Okay, so I could be talking about this forever, but I know that you have to get back to where it is the beginning of your workday. Do you feel like the ability to actually potentially have murdered a rival is another sort of marker that queens are coming into their own, having their own power, becoming something that is distinct in its own right? Maybe this is a tricky question.
It is a tricky question. It's not one that I really thought of before, but I actually really like that point because the sort of anonymous women we tend to get in the late 9th century, Alfred's wife, Ealhswith, we get a few little stories about her, a few little stories about Alfred's mum, but they're very maternal stories, about how they're kindly educating their children. We're not seeing very domestic settings. We're not seeing any genuine political power, I don't think. But you're right. I mean, increasingly we see these queens exercising political power through Eadgifu in particular. But by the time you get to Aethelflaed, she's just a real practical politician. She just is doing the things that need to be done. She's appearing in prominent places in charter witness lists. She's Regina everywhere. She has a proper office. And I think once you've got that level of power, you gather allies around yourself. And if you need to have somebody murdered, well, why not? The only difference between her and any other earl or office holder in the kingdom is that she's female.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Well, thank you. This is a great place to end the podcast. No, I just think that if you can have somebody murdered and no one necessarily blinks at or wants to take on the person who they think might have done it, this might be a signal that things are changing.
Yes, that's right. Look, and the murder introduces a bit of instability, of course. Aethelred the Unready, I mean, poor lad, he does last for a very long time. He has an extremely long reign. It's 46 years or something like that. But we often sort of blame him for his poor decision making, etc. But again, he comes to the throne as a 10-year-old. He's just having to listen to the people around him. We've had a long sort of peaceful reign under Edgar. So people don't really know how to sort of cope with the resurgence of Viking attacks because they hadn't experienced it before. But also, he's come to the throne with his power base slightly weakened because there's always this thing hanging over him and Aelfthryth. Are there a couple of murderers leading the kingdom at this point in time? Yeah, and that's quite a weapon to be able to use against someone politically, I think.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think that your discussion of these queens from this moment in history hopefully will stir people to think more about these individuals and the power that they're wielding, especially these women who otherwise don't really show up very much in the document. So thank you, Matthew, for coming on and telling us all about these early English queens.
Excellent. Thank you for having me.
To find out more about Matthew's work, you can visit his faculty page at Flinders University. His new book is Early English Queens, 850 to 1000, Potestas Reginae. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. So it's early January, and we still have some big news for medievalists. There was a new study in the journal Nature just got released, and it's a new way of studying ancient DNA, a new tool. It's called TwigStats.
TwigStats.
Get used to that weird name. It's supposed to make it a lot more precise to match up ancient genomes and things like that and give us even better answers. So all the studies that came before, they all have to be redone.
I mean, that's the nature of technology. That's the nature of the work. I think we all have to expect that.
Indeed. So in the article in Nature, they looked back at 1,500 genomes from the first millennium AD and trying to see what they could find out. A lot of it kind of confirms what was already known, stuff about the Norse, about migrations, things like that. A couple of fun little bits. They found that there was a Roman soldier that was buried in York. He may have been a gladiator. He's 1/4 Scandinavian.
There we go. The Roman Empire was vast. We know this for sure.
Indeed. And then we also have information that Central Europeans started going into Scandinavia before the Viking Age. So there was a little migration northwards. That's kind of interesting. So they're saying it's a new era for ancient DNA research.
Well, awesome. Bring it on. Can't wait to find out what they learn from it.
So we've got that news. Plus, we have 10 medieval insults and also Steve Tibble on Did the Templars Have a Secret Treasure?
It's the Holy Grail, isn't it? And it's on Oak Island. It just hasn't been found in many seasons of Secrets of Oak Island.
I know that's where you'll be spending your summer.
Absolutely. I spend my summer every year just digging for Templar treasure. That's what I do.
So if you're looking for treasure, Templar treasure, you should read up Steve's article.
Always read Steve's articles. Well, thank you, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you who support my work through letting the ads play through, recommending my books and podcasts to all your friends, and becoming patrons on patreon.com. Patrons can listen to this podcast ad-free and get monthly curated lists of open access materials, along with all the good karma that patronage provides. Your kind generosity allows me to keep this podcast going, so thank you. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from queens to jeans, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN-medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist, and you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.